In the following video, we will discuss organs in animals and plants. So we'll begin with a basic definition of what an organ is. So an organ is an organized group of tissues that work together to perform a specific function. Each organ is made up of a series of tissues that work together to perform that specific purpose. If you'll recall from previous lessons, we've talked about the different types of tissues, the epithelial, connective, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and the fact that tissues are groups of cells now that work together to perform a specific task. An organ now is a grouping of tissues now that will work together for a larger specific purpose. And the fact is that all of our organs now, they do play a vital role in maintaining the health of our bodies. So the first organ that we'll talk about is the skin. The skin is the largest organ in the body that will protect the inner cells from damage. Because of this, it acts as a defense barrier against organisms. It also works to release heat and will excrete waste from the body. The skin is made up of two different layers of tissues. The first layer is the epidermis, which is that outer protective tissue, which is mainly made up of epithelial tissue. It will prevent bacteria and viruses from entering the body, and it also will make vitamin D when your skin is exposed to UV radiation. Below the epidermis, we find the dermis, which is that inner layer, which is made up of connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. So that connective tissue provides structure and support. If you'll recall, blood is a type of connective tissue, and what this will do is that it will, those blood vessels will dilate to release excess heat or secrete sweat to help cool the body if it's too hot. The dermis also contains nerves that work to sense pain, pressure, heat, as well as cold, and it will also transmit this information to your brain to tell it, hey, something's going on. The next organ that we'll talk about are the lungs. So the lungs are a pair of organs involved in respiration. They allow you to breathe in the oxygen that your cells need and to get rid of the carbon dioxide that is produced as a waste product. In an adult human, one lung is about 1 kilogram, with half of that mass being blood. The other half is made up of connective and epithelial tissue. The lungs are coated with sacs of connective tissue separated by a thin layer of fluid. What this does is it offers protection and reduces the effects of friction when the lungs move. So as you breathe in, your lungs will expand and tend to want to rub against the walls of your chest cavity. And that rubbing of that of your lungs against that wall is what creates that friction. And so this thin layer of fluid helps reduce that friction between the two. So what happens during that process of respiration? So when you breathe in air through your nose or mouth, the air passes through your pharynx and moves into your trachea. The trachea is that flexible tube that is ringed with cartilage. If you were to feel your throat, it is that hard tube that you feel right at the front of your throat. As air moves down the trachea, it moves into what's called the bronchus. From the bronchus, it moves into smaller tubes called bronchial tubes, and then into tiny little air sacs called alveoli. Alveoli are made of a thin layer of epithelial tissue. Your alveoli actually have a single layer of cells, those epithelial cells. The alveoli is surrounded by thin-walled blood vessels, which are called capillaries. and each lung contains about 150 million alveoli. So that's a lot of space dedicated towards getting oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. So the following video will walk you through that process of respiration.
The process of exchanging gases between the atmosphere and the body's cells is called respiration and involves several events, including breathing. As we zoom into the body, we can observe the respiratory system during gas exchange. Air passes through the alveolar sacs to the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. In this cutaway view of an alveolar sac and its capillary bed, the process of gas exchange is easily observed. During inspiration, atmosphere air fills the alveoli and gas exchange occurs between the alveolar and capillary epithelia. Oxygen in inspired air is represented as a white gas. Carbon dioxide in expired air is represented as a blue gas. Notice the changing color in the red blood cells during gas exchange. Now let's zoom into a higher magnification view of gas exchange at the respiratory membrane. Red blood cells in the capillary adjacent to the alveolus release carbon dioxide and bind oxygen.
So the next organ that we will talk about is the heart. The heart is a muscular pump that will supply blood to all parts of the body. An adult human heart is about 300 grams in mass and is about the size of a fist. Because your heart is a pump and it's beating all the time, over the course of an average lifetime, the heart will beat about 3.5 billion times. So that's a lot of times over somebody's life. So, you need it to work consistently and regularly. The heart is divided into 4 different chambers. We have the left and right atria, or atrium if you're just talking about one, and the left and right ventricles. So the diagram off to the right actually shows how blood moves through the heart. So all blood enters the heart from the vena cava, and it enters the heart as deoxygenated blood, which is denoted by the blue lines. The blood enters into the right atrium. The right atrium will then contract, squeezing that blood into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, the blood, that deoxygenated blood, is then pumped to the lungs by the pulmonary arteries. The blood travels to the lungs where it releases its carbon dioxide, picks up oxygen, and then returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins. And that oxygenated blood is now indicated by red lines. So that blood will enter into the heart, into the left atrium. The left atrium will then contract, squeezing that blood into the left ventricle. It's within the left ventricle now that tremendous amounts of pressure is applied to the blood, and you'll note that this layer, particularly of the heart, is rather thick. The left ventricle now is going to squeeze and contract and force that blood to the rest of the body. So that particular part of the heart needs to be strong and to provide the force needed. So now when the left ventricle contracts, it will send that blood into the aorta, where it will travel to the rest of the body and supply the body with the blood that is needed. The next organs, the series of organs that we'll talk about, are those involved in digestion. So this diagram just outlines the main organs involved in that process of digestion. So within digestion now, it all begins in the mouth. So the mouth takes in food to begin digestion. Your mouth is lined with epithelial tissues, and has glands that will secrete mucus, saliva, and enzymes. So when you're chewing on food, that saliva that's produced releases, contains a lot of mucus, a lot of saliva, and a lot of enzymes as well. The tongue is also lined with epithelial tissue and glands, connective tissues, and muscle tissues as well. So those enzymes within your saliva help start that process of digestion, starting to break down your food. Once food enters into your body, it travels from your mouth down a tube called your esophagus. Your esophagus is actually located right behind your trachea. It's a soft, flexible tube. And so as that food moves along due to a rhythmic constriction and relaxation of the smooth muscle cells that are found in the esophagus, that regular contraction and relaxation is a movement that we actually call peristalsis. And it's this constricting and relaxing that will move food through your body and down through your esophagus. The esophagus is also lined with more epithelial tissue. Further down the esophagus, food will enter into the stomach. The stomach is made up of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous, and muscle tissues as well. Within the stomach, food churns and mixes with digestive juices and with enzymes, and so it will digest and break down the food even more. Finally, digested nutrients and undigested waste move into the small and large intestines. These are areas of chemical digestion and removal of waste. Solid waste is stored in the rectum and exits the body through the anus. So we'll leave behind the animal organs and get into plant organs. So unlike humans, a flowering plant is made up of 4 types of plant tissues. We have the epidermal, the ground, vascular, and meristematic tissues. These plant tissues can group together to form 4 large major organs of the plant. So the roots, the leaves, the stem, and the flower. So these are the 4 major organs that we find within a plant. So looking at each of those organs, starting with the roots. The roots are what anchor the plant in the soil. They collect water from the ground, and they also have to transport that water to the stem, and they will also store food made in other parts of the plant. The bottom of the root is covered with protective epidermal tissue known as the root cap. Just below is a layer of meristematic tissue which allows the root to grow. There are also layers of ground and vascular tissue that make up the center of the root. The next organ that we'll discuss is the leaf. So tissues work together to accomplish photosynthesis. Are the vascular tissue, which carries water from the root up to the stem to the leaf. Sugar that is produced is carried by the vascular tissue to the rest of the plant. Carbon dioxide also enters through the leaf, and oxygen and excess water exit through openings in the leaf epidermal tissue, which are called stomata. These openings are controlled by what are called guard cells. Leaves are mostly made up of specialized ground tissue called mesophyll. So in the diagram just below here, we have a cross-section of what a leaf looks like. So we could think of this as being the top, and this being the bottom of the leaf. So those stomata and those guard cells we find at the bottom, and they basically create a ring at the bottom of the leaf, and they can open and close to allow in CO2 and will release oxygen gas. The next organ that we'll discuss is the stem. So the stem will perform two major functions for the plant. It transports water and nutrients throughout the plant and supports the leaves and flowers. Epidermal tissue provides a protective covering and allows exchange of gases and water vapor. Epidermal tissue may also secrete a waxy substance known as the cuticle. This forms a protective coating around the plant, on the stem and the leaves as well, and will reduce the amount of water loss by the plant. Ground tissue will provide the stem with strength and support, so it's kind of what makes it structurally sound. And vascular tissue, which we also find in the stem, will transport substances around the plant as needed, from the leaves to the roots and roots to the leaves. One of the last structures that we'll talk about, one of the last organs that we'll talk about in the plant is the flower. So the flower is basically the reproductive structure of the plant, which will produce seeds through sexual reproduction. Within flowers, we find male organs, which we call the stamen, and have a filament with an anther at the tip. This produces pollen, which are the male sex cells. So a lot of us are allergic to pollen, myself included. So if you think about it, the pollen that we're allergic to are the sex cells, or the male sex cells of the flowers. Female organs, called the pistil, have an ovary. They also have a style and stigma. When the pollen and an egg unite, the fertilized egg will now become a seed. Some seeds are surrounded by flesh and contain a lot of sugar, which we like to call fruit, stuff that we like to consume. Other seeds are encased in a shell, and basically all new cells are made from meristematic tissue, just a reminder. So the diagram off to the right actually shows those different structures that we find within a flower. So here we have everything that goes into making up the pistil, and the different parts that go up into making the stamen. We have the filament here, which pulls the anther, which is where the pollen is contained. And then we have the stigma, and below it is the ovary where the eggs are contained. So basically that pollen needs to travel from the anther to the stigma and combine with the ovary to produce a seed. So when you stop and think about it, when you stop and smell the flowers, when you stick your nose into a flower, you're basically sticking your nose into the reproductive parts of a plant. And so one last video.
There's now no escape. The beetle struggles and stimulates the plant to close the trap even more tightly. It now produces digestive acids and glands on the inner surface of the leaf, which first kill
and then dissolve its victim's body. Growing in the same Carolina swamp, there's another carnivorous plant. These are the trumpet pitches. They, like the Venice's flytrap, find so little nutriment in this impoverished waterlogged soil that they supplement it with the bodies of animals. Their traps are also formed from leaves, but leaves that have been folded lengthways to make a vertical tube which fills with water. These spectacular trumpets may look like flowers, but of course they're not, though in a sense this bright yellow toxin serves the same purpose as the cap. It's an advertisement of a delicious reward, and the reward itself is under here. Sweet nectar. And if an insect comes to collect it and strays into the mouth of the trumpet, then it's doomed. Inside of the throat of the trumpet is covered with microscopic downward pointing spines. As long as it stays on the ground, the ant is alright. But if it strays off it, it falls into a pond of water and drowns. The tiny corpse dissolves, the marsh pitcher absorbs the resulting soup. And where one ant goes, others are likely to follow. The marsh pitcher attracts other animals too. This frog may be hoping to eat some of the insects before the pitcher does, but if it loses its footing, the plant will eat it.
All right, so that does it for this video on organs found in animals and plants. For a bit of practice, please do the following questions. So page 63 in your textbook, questions 9, 10, 11, 14, 16, and 17.